remember when I was in high school, 17 magazine was popular. It's probably now atrocious and completely not politically correct. I have no idea. But I remember that there was a quiz in that magazine. You were supposed to take the quiz and it was going to tell you whether you're going to have a job, a career, or a calling. And I remember taking that quiz and being like, well, I'm never going to have a calling. Like, that's for weird people. I'm going to have probably a series of careers, because that was, how I was like trained to think. And what I've learned in the last decade or so is that underneath all of my career choices, there is a calling, but it's a kind of quiet one. And it's really that root interest that connects all of the other career choices.
I'm so excited to be speaking with Bree Rosenblum, Professor of Global Change Biology and the Koshland Distinguished Chair for Innovative Teaching and Research at UC Berkeley. Her work has been featured broadly in the press, including the New York Times, National Geographic, the Discovery Channel, NPR, the BBC movie Endangered, and on the TEDx stage. Bree weaves her work on the biodiversity of our planet with her passion for supporting others on the journey of life as a coach, consultant, and workshop facilitator. She draws on an eclectic background as a professor, author, meditation teacher, potter, climber, roving naturalist, and art nerd. Bree received her BA from Brown University and her PhD from UC Berkeley. Her new book, And the Tiny Word That Can Radically Transform Your Life, offers a personal and universal approach to cultivating an ampersand life. Bree, welcome to the show.
So glad to be here with you, Jessica.
I am so excited to speak with you and learn more about how you got to where you are. Your work as a scientist and researcher is around understanding the biological diversity of our planet. Questions like, how are new species formed, and why are species being lost at such an alarming rate in today's world? What led you down this path initially?
Well, Jessica, I'm not one of those scientists that grew up from a really young age knowing exactly what I wanted to do. In fact, I think like many ampersands, I think of my early years as kind of a pendulum swinging. I did a lot of work in science. I did a lot of work in art. I did a lot of work in education. And I kind of figured that the way you choose a career is you just wait and see which one of your pendulum swings sticks. And so the science one, in a way, was the easiest to stick, even though it didn't represent all of my interests. There's some real deep passion for me about nature and about trying to understand what makes our natural world tick. And so there was a natural draw towards nature, but I would say not necessarily a natural draw towards being a scientist. That, I think, was essentially me trying to take my wide range of interests and kind of narrow them into a bucket that seemed like it could be a career.
Yeah. Academia is typically known for being a really great place for specialists and sometimes introverts. And you've done something pretty remarkable in the amount of depth that you've achieved as a researcher and a professor, while at the same time connecting that depth with breadth of other areas like art, spirituality, and coaching. You share in your book a few critical moments in your life that led you to think more expansively. When you think back on your experiences, do you feel like that ampersand that as a young child was there kind of went away and was coaxed out of you over time? What was that like?
I love that question because I do think that as ampersands, we have so many different interests and it always feels like there's so many different paths we could go down. And I think one of the fallacies and one of the accidental either ors that we fall into as ampersands is we think we need to choose one interest or another for our actual career and then keep all of our other ampersand interests kind of on the side as hobbies or like being balanced on a scale. And for me, I think in a way, it's not that my ampersand went away, but I really did try to channel my energies into one direction for the early part of my academic career. And that did not work, as you can see, that it felt like, like every time I tried to trim a branch off of my ampersand, it just grew back bigger. And so at some point in my career, I really had to confront, okay, I have tried to narrow myself again and again and again, and it just doesn't work. So what does it look like not to narrow myself? And I would say that there was one moment that when you asked that question, I hadn't thought of before our conversation, but that just came back really strongly to me. which is that when I returned, I did my PhD at UC Berkeley, and then I returned many years later as a professor. And I sat down we were each assigned a senior professor who was supposed to mentor us as we kind of got comfortable at Berkeley. And we sat down and he said, Bree, you don't have to be a jerk to succeed as an academic, but it really helps. And I just don't think your elbows are sharp enough to succeed in this world. And that was really a moment where there's been lots of little moments throughout my life where I was like, oh, I don't want to play by the rules of someone else's game. And that was one of those moments for me that even though it was a small moment, it was a teeny moment in the sunshine in Berkeley over a cup of coffee. It was like, oh, right, I'm at another crossroads where I either can decide to play the kind of traditional academic game where I'm out for myself, I try to build a big empire, or I can make a different choice.
And one of the key forward sentences that you share in your book is, I changed my mind. And this is such a great reminder of the freedom that we can really give ourselves, just even knowing this phrase. You mentioned that one of your proudest moments was actually choosing to leave some of your more formal leadership positions at UC Berkeley. You had the honor of leading some big campus-wide programs like Berkeley Connect and Berkeley Discover. And you took a big risk without knowing where it would lead. How did you find the courage to kind of break free from those more traditional roles? And what opened up for you moving on?
Yeah. So I think, one of the things that I think ampersands need to live their lives by in some way is we don't always learn the most by getting what we want. And so sometimes we push ourselves, but sometimes our life circumstances push us. And so for me, one of the things that happened at Berkeley is I was pursuing not only my own individual research, but also a lot of leadership activities in higher education. I was really excited about how can we make education itself not feel like an either or in people's lives, right? Mm-hmm. Either I have to find a career to make money or pursue my passions. Either I have to tick all the boxes as fast as possible for my degree, or I need to invest in deeper self-exploration. So I was really interested in how can we make higher education itself feel like a both and really offer lots of opportunities to young people. And I think what I noticed in myself, and I noticed in talking with many ampersands, is that there's always this little question of where do we belong? Should we be in the system working to change it? Should we be outside of the system kind of fighting against it? Or should we be doing our own thing that's not really in reference to the system? And what happened for me in the kind of transition period of deciding, I'm still a professor at Berkeley. I still love teaching. I love my job. But in deciding to leave kind of the more formal leadership aspects of my work at Berkeley was to realize that it was time for me in my life. And I also think, in a sense, time for all of us in our world to stop referencing ourselves completely against the system and to see what would happen if I wasn't embedded in a system, trying to improve it or change it, but I was actually just really doing my own thing and creating my own inspiration from the ground up. And so that led me to take a sabbatical from UC Berkeley, at which time I wrote this book, even though it was a surprise because I thought I was writing a different book. But I also started a new educational nonprofit to really try to foster these kinds of principles from the ground up rather than trying to change a system that already exists. And for me, one of the things is the question of what size ship do you want to be sailing? So as a professor in Berkeley, that's a big ship, and it takes a lot to turn kind of an oil tanker size ship. Whereas for me, on my own with close collaborators starting a new nonprofit, that's much more of a nimble kind of sailboat. And it feels appropriate to these times we live in that are so disrupted and disrupting to be able to move a little quicker and kind of follow the tides and serve people a little more quickly with what I feel that people need right now in the moment, rather than making plans for 5 or 10 years out.
I resonate so deeply with what you said about being within the system, outside of the system, or kind of building your own system. And I want to dig in to something that you mentioned. You shared that you were actually working on a totally different book, a more serious book about science and spirituality. And then you scrapped it in favor of writing And. What was that shift like?
So the first book that I was trying to write was a very serious endeavor. It was trying to link science and spirituality in a way that I felt would do both topics justice. But really what it was doing is it was kind of bogging me down in the need to have all of my diverse interests kind of come forth together in this perfect package. And one morning I woke up and I was like, you know what? This can be fun. and and the second I thought this could be fun, which I know seems a little superficial, but I think so often, especially if we're folks that are drawn towards excellence, we can fall into a little trap of taking ourselves and our work too seriously. So the impulse of this could be fun is actually a deep impulse, not a superficial impulse. It's an impulse of humility and inspiration and lightheartedness. And so the moment I thought this could be fun, all of a sudden, this whole new book popped up. And I knew that I was going to have to discover it by writing it rather than plan it out and then execute. And so that was really kind of the fun of how And emerged, is not only was the book itself a surprise, but then the process of writing it really revealed what I wanted to share with people.
And it is a lot of fun. It's both whimsical and deep. You share a lot of personal anecdotes and personal stories in the book as well. It's really an amazing primer for anybody who identifies as an ampersand or aspiring ampersand, or really anybody that's looking for hope or optimism in their lives. One of my key takeaways from your book was that we need to really trust in ourselves and also in the world around us, and really believe that things will work out. On the surface, this intuition, or some might call it unexplained faith, it seems like the opposite of science, which perhaps is what you wanted to explore with this first book. What would you say to somebody, maybe even an academic, who's having a hard time kind of holding both of these ideas?
Yeah, that's such a great question, because in a way, even though the book is lighthearted, in a way, it's kind of about healing our relationship with ourselves, each other, and life itself. Because so many of us, especially those who grew up in a more, structured, scientific, academic environment, really have a pretty deep skepticism, not just of spirituality writ large, but just of life. Like, is there something to trust? Can we even trust ourselves? And those questions, I think, are ones that are really essential that we answer right now. So I think that you're right. I think that that is a core motivation for me, is kind of healing our relationship with life and our relationship with trust. And for me, the reconciliation between more of a scientific perspective and a spiritual perspective on this is that no matter what perspective we take, we are not outsiders looking in, nor are we really insiders looking out. Like, I'll give you an example from science. I'm an evolutionary biologist. I study the tree of life. I study how we get new species and how we lose species. And a lot of times scientists feel like, oh, well, they're scientists and they're studying life. And it's like, we're here and life is somehow someplace else. And if you look even scientifically, not spiritually, just scientifically at the tree of life, we are not like somehow separate from the rest of life. We are deeply embedded in this multifaceted tree. And the same is true ecologically. You can't take us out of nature. And so I think that there is an absolute scientific rigor to the robust answer that we are not separate. We are not separate. That is true scientifically, and spirituality is a different way to come to that same conclusion, that we are not separate. But I think if I was an economist, or I was, whatever else I might be, I would have a way within my own field, within my own set of norms, to come to the same conclusion that we are not separate. I think for me, that's why the way that book came out, it's really in some ways, it's a method. It's really an approach to get back into conversation with your own life. And it's not only proposing what I think are some pretty deep and high principles that we could live by, but it's proposing a pretty specific method to get there, which starts always with what's going on. So it doesn't start with, oh, I need to wait for a big awakening experience, or, oh, I need to be 10,000 times better than I already am, or, oh, I need to erase all this trauma from my background. It always starts with where we are. And so I developed this kind of 4-question approach to get people back into conversation with their life. And for me, it's so important that that first question of what's going on just starts exactly with where we are, because that's always true. Our journey always starts with exactly where we are. And my experience in both science and spirituality is that often people really want to start someplace they're not. And that doesn't help us. It doesn't help us in our careers. It doesn't help us in our relationships with other people. And it doesn't help us with our relationship with life.
Let's take a moment to reflect on Bree's first question that she uses in her book, And. Remember to start with where you are now. What's going on? Outside of hosting this podcast, I partner with leaders in the workplace to turn professional challenges into leadership successes and career progression. I love working with executive leaders, people managers, and of course, ampersands. If any of this sounds interesting to you, reach out to me at jessicawan.com. That's JESSICAWAN. Now, back to the show. Let's talk about frogs.
Okay.
You and your colleagues worked for over 20 years to save an endangered frog species from extinction. What did you learn from that experience?
For me, the moment of hiking up with a collaborator who's been dear to me for 25 years and hiking up to this lake where I knew there used to be no frogs, and cresting the hill and seeing this sandy wash on the edge of the lake and seeing all of these little brown dots. And I couldn't quite tell what they were until we got closer and closer. And as that resolved, I realized that they were hundreds of frogs just perched on the edge of the pond. And as we got closer still, I saw thousands of tadpoles swimming around. And this is a lake that had nothing in it, when we started this project. And huge credit to my collaborators. Roland Knapp is the one who really was the one who rescued these frogs. I've been, in that universe. But what it meant for me to see the recovery of those frogs was 2 really important things that I think are generalizable to our lives. The first is about biological resilience. It was realizing that for all of the species, and obviously we've had colossal impacts on species around the world. So this is not just oh, yay, we can save all the species, because that's not what I'm proposing here. But the idea and the reality that we actually can, in very low-tech ways, bring species back from the brink of extinction, essentially with our caring. This recovery project was not a multi-million-dollar project that used genetic engineering. This recovery project used Roland, my collaborator, frogs, and a backpack, essentially, and then some sophisticated tools for monitoring the populations as they recovered. And so the seeing that how resilient life is when we kind of get out of its way feels to me not only about frogs, it's about a lot of other things that are happening in our lives and the world. So the first is really a lesson in biological resilience. The second is a deep lesson for me about caring and collaboration, because as much as we all do our own thing in life, it's not just that the frogs are embedded in this inextricable web of life, but we are too, as scientists and as humans. And that project never would have worked without collaboration. And to see kind of the strength of our collaborative network then mirrored in the recovering ecology of the Sierra Nevada, because it's not just that the frogs came back. As I was walking around that pond, I started seeing garter snakes. You started seeing more birds. You started seeing all sorts of elements of the ecology of that ecosystem start coming back and coming back together. And so I think kind of that phrase, which I've never said before until right now with you, but this idea of coming back together feels really, really important right now in our world, because we do need to come back. We do need a sense of resilience in our lives. But I really do very foundationally believe that is an act and a gesture of togetherness.
Coming back together. I love that. Something we've talked about a lot on this show is how our ampersands sometimes change over time. We might straddle multiple worlds across our whole lives, but the specific roles we take on and how our ampersands are expressed, they might change and evolve. How do you think about this for yourself?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question because I think that a lot of times there's kind of almost a life cycle in ampersand's life, right? And early on, I think for myself, it felt more like I was trying to balance different interests rather than integrate them. And so I think that's what I see as kind of the trajectory in my own life is that my roles have changed, but they're getting kind of the roles themselves are becoming more integrative roles. So rather than kind of being a scientist in my day job and then an artist in my free time, it's those interests have started to weave together in new ways. And I think the single biggest thing that has allowed that integration to start happening is that I've gotten much clearer about what is the deeper kind of fuel that fuels all of my interests. Because on the surface, being interested, being a meditation teacher and a science professor and, obsessed with making things out of clay, they seem like really different interests, but they actually all connect back to a central motivation, which is that I am totally fascinated by the process of transformation. So so I'm not a scientist randomly. I'm an evolutionary biologist because that's the branch of science that deals with transformation. I'm not interested just in religion in general. I'm interested in meditation because that to me is a fundamentally transformative process. And even within art, I'm interested in art in general, but I get particularly jazzed about transformative practices. So, how you turn one element into another or how you change by writing a book. And so for me, the root interest is really about transformation, and then that's expressed in all of these different ways. I think that for me, rather than looking towards a new role of like, oh, well, now I want to be a X or a Y or a Z, it's more, I want to do a better job being faithful to my core interest in transformation and being faithful to that without paying the price of trying to kind of water it down to fit in different environments. Because if your core interest is transformation, you kind of have to water that down a little bit to, be a quote, good scientist or a good, and so kind of letting go of the idea that I or any of us are supposed to be like a good X or a good Y. It's more, we are really supposed to listen to what is that deeper purpose and calling that then gives all of our career choices meaning. And I'll just give you a teeny little anecdote here that it came to mind is I remember when I was in high school, 17 magazine was popular. It's probably now atrocious and completely not politically correct. I have no idea. But I remember that there was a quiz in that magazine. You were supposed to take the quiz and it was going to tell you whether you're going to have a job, a career, or a calling. And I remember taking that quiz and being like, well, I'm never going to have a calling. Like that's for weird people. I'm going to have probably a series of careers because that was, how I was like trained to think. And what I've learned in the last decade or so is that underneath all of my career choices, there is a calling, but it's a kind of quiet one. And it's really that root interest that connects all of the other career choices.
I think this is so valuable for our listeners. And I'm curious if you think back to the past decade, if there were inflection points or inspiration points that really helped you start putting together the root interest, and start really living into that instead of the roles within the various systems.
Yeah, well, and I'll say this mirrors exactly the process I propose in my book as a kind of method and landmark for others is that it always starts with where you are. And then for me, actually, it always goes to what my second question in this process after, what's going on is what are my deeper fears? So actually, all of the landmarks that have led to bigger integration and bigger inspiration always started from some kind of constraint, conflict, compromise.
Mm.
They always started with a moment that wasn't good. They always started with, crying in the bathroom because something wasn't going my way, or feeling like the breath was getting sucked out of me because I was conforming more than I wanted to, or feeling a great disappointment that a particular next opportunity didn't come my way. So those moments, if we don't rush by them, but instead we use them as basically tunneling moments, right? Of like, oh, I'm disappointed. I'm frustrated. I'm hurt. I feel broken. I feel terrified. Like if we actually use those to kind of go down the internal elevator, that actually opens into a great landscape of truth. And so it's usually through those kinds of challenges that folks with, either internal guidance in their own process or external support with, collaboration or coaching or community, that people can make that transition from, oh, I've just suffered a huge setback. And that actually opens this deeper question of what is true? What is true? Like, oh yeah, I have compromised. What is true? Oh, maybe I don't want to anymore. And so that step of, okay, where am I right now? What are my deeper fears? What's actually true? Then leads to this action question, which is my fourth question of what now? Like, okay, so what is the right career choice for me now? So I would say that I know it's a little bit of a more general answer to your question rather than a specific answer about a specific career moment, but I would say that is the general pattern is I'm aware of there's some kind of conflict or constraint. I actually go into it instead of out of it. And I use that juice, that disappointment, to ask the deeper question of what's true and how do I realign my life with that truth that I've discovered. And that's the process I use. I use that process every single day. And sometimes, more intensely than others, but every single day.
I love it. I am having this visualization come to mind of like the caterpillar going into the cocoon, and boy, that must be really uncomfortable, right?
Yeah.
Spending all that time to transform.
Well, and Jessica, I love this. This image has come up with so many people right now. So many of my students and so many of my clients have said, I'm really resonating with the chrysalis image because as a biologist, just for a last little biology tidbit, what's happening in that chrysalis is intense, right? Like the caterpillar is actually digesting all of its own tissues and then rebuilding itself. And so it's not just like a pleasant image of like, oh, and then someday I'll be a beautiful butterfly. It's like, no, this is a rigorous process. Being a caterpillar turning into a butterfly is hard. Being a human in a transformational moment in your life is hard. And the hard doesn't mean that you're doing something wrong. The hard is actually an indication that the transformational fire is really strong in your life right now. And so that would be, one of the single biggest things I would love ampersands to remember is that obviously we want joy, we want inspiration, we want pleasure. We get all of those things. It's an and, right? But if you want all of those, quote, positive things, the ampersand there is that you have to be willing to walk through the fire of some of the things that we judge as negative. And so the depth to me of being an ampersand, it's not just, oh, I get to have multiple career interests. It's like, no, actually, we're trying to resolve some of the deepest questions and deepest struggles that humans confront. We're trying to figure out the relationship between pleasure and pain, between life and death, between fear and hope. And so all of those are ampersand questions. It's how do we bring divergent, almost contradictory things together, not just in our careers, but in our lives and in our hearts.
Through these interviews, we are co-creating the Ampersand Manifesto, Principles for Leading a Multi-Passionate Life. I know you share so many wonderful principles in the book, but right now, in the moment, what would you like to share with our listeners?
Well, I would say the things that came up most strongly for me in our dialogue together, Jessica, are don't try to figure it out ahead of time. You aren't on the outside looking in and trying to orchestrate this thing called life. Like you are living it. And so as much as you are living life, life is living you. And so as much as you can give yourself permission to not be prepared and to not always have to think strategically and not always know where you're going, that actually is going to allow for a very rich blooming of and in your life.
This has been so wonderful. Bree, you are a true ampersand, and it's been such an honor talking with you. Folks, you can sign up for Bree's mailing list and find out about her workshops and coaching at breerose.com. Also, follow Bree on Amazon to see her books and plus the guided companion journal. We'll link to these in the show notes. I had a chance to listen back on my interview with Bree, and I wanted to share a few key takeaways. 1, I was curious going into this conversation about how Bree got so deep into science, especially as someone who has always had many different interests. Her story of having a passion narrowing into a career made me reflect. Does some version of this actually happen to most of us? Reflecting on my own career in marketing, even though I didn't stay in the same industry for 20 years, there was always a clear progression from associate to manager to director, etc., etc. I tell everyone that I fell into marketing, and in retrospect, it's easy to see how my passion for understanding people narrowed into a career with a clear path and ladder. 2, for ampersands, should we be in the system, outside of the system, or building our own system? This resonates so deeply with my own journey and in many parts of my life. I loved this question of what size ship do you want to be steering? And also, I think that life and careers are long enough that you really can try on different iterations at different points in your life. For a long time, I was in the system, sometimes part of a container ship, sometimes steering a sailboat. Those experiences of being in the system helped me tremendously for my career now as an executive coach. I am now building my own system, but with a deep understanding of what it's like to be in it and outside it. 3, Bree talked about moving from a focus on balance earlier in her life to now a focus on integration, and how her interests have started to weave together in fun and new ways. This prompt of what is the deeper fuel that fuels all of your interests is such a great one for ampersands. For Bree, she's fascinated by the process of transformation. For those of us who play many roles and have many interests, it can be a challenge to find what that deeper fuel really is. Mine is still a work in progress, and I think this show is helping me refine it.